udruge za razvoj civilnog društva Smart koji se zove Nova pravila igre. Provodimo ga sa cijelim nizom partnera. I to spominjem između ostalog i zato jer ću vas zamoliti da i napravimo nekoliko fotografija koje služe između ostalog kao dokaz da se ovaj događaj dogodio prilikom našeg izvještavanja o provedbi projekta pa i ove konkretne aktivnosti, pa vam hvala na razumijevanju i za to. Kad već spominjem ovaj projekt, dakle Nova pravila igre, on je u samom finišu, dakle završava sa 31.12. Proveli smo cijeli niz različitih aktivnosti, a ovaj naš današnji susret i ovo predavanje Roka Kranjca je zapravo dio malog ciklusa predavanja koje smo nazvali Pogled u održivo susjedstvo. Naime, ideja je da počevši sa današnjim predavanjem održimo još 3 predavanja na teme koje su direktno ili indirektno vezane uz koncept i područje održivog razvoja. Na kraju današnjeg susreta mogu još posebno i najaviti i hoću za sve vas koji želite znati o čemu ćemo još razgovarati tijekom mjeseca prosinca sa našim gostima iz Slovenije. A ono što ću posebno najaviti jest da ćemo imati i do kraja godine predstavljanje procesa osmišljavanja, dizajniranja i produkcije naše društvene igre na kojoj smo radili kolegica Tamara Fabac i ja, koju srdačno pozdravljam, i danas će biti zadužena posebno da s tehničke strane sve u ovom današnjem susretu funkcionira najbolje što je to moguće, a isto tako da svi vi koji budete htjeli nešto reći dođete u priliku nešto reći tijekom drugog dijela našeg današnjeg susreta, tako da pratite naše web stranice, naše Facebook stranice u nadi da ćete biti zainteresirani da saznate više o našoj igri koja se zove Zadnja šansa i bavi se globalnim ciljevima održivog razvoja. Čisto za možda kao mali teaser, radi se o jednostavnoj roll and write igri koja ima određene obrazovne komponente, a možda ćemo o toj temi i zapravo na neki način je povezana i sa temom današnjeg razgovora, ali nećemo ulaziti dublje u našu igru jer ćemo se tome posvetiti negdje pred sam kraj ove godine. Dakle, ciklus predavanja u okviru festivala održivosti, dobar dio ključnih aktivnosti sam već barem načelno spomenuo, neću ulaziti u druge, ali ćemo isprezentirati do kraja ove godine i cijeli niz drugih stvari kojima smo se mi i naši partneri bavili. A ja predlažem da polako završim sa ovim mojim kratkim uvodom u ovaj naš današnji susret i da ponovim da je zapravo naš današnji cilj da predstavimo koncept ozbiljnih društvenih igara i da o tome popričamo. I kao što vjerujem znate, predavanje i razgovor će se voditi na engleskom jeziku. Ako budete imali neko pitanje, želite ga postaviti na hrvatskom, to nam je isto ok, mi ćemo pokušati ga prevesti na engleski jezik, a ja bih sad, kad ga već spominjem, engleski jezik, pokušao i prebaciti se na engleski. In order to say hello to Rok Kranjc, thank you again for joining us today and for preparing the lecture, the presentation about serious board games and how can they change the world if they can. I suppose that the answer, at least on your side, is positive, that they can at least make some impact in that context. As we agreed, I just gave a brief introduction to our today's meeting and the broader context. Why did we meet today? And I don't know, I suppose that everybody who's here with us today saw your short bio during our promotional activities, but I would like to say that you are an educator, a consultant, you are a journalist, a translator, an activist, but the main reason why you are here today, you are also a designer of serious board games. Before we delve into the main topic, the serious board games, just one question to maybe get to know you a bit more. How come that you got involved in designing serious board game? Were you a video gamer, a board gamer? Please give us shed some light on your path to becoming a serious board game designer. Thank you again. Thank you to all. Rok, please.
Thanks, Igor, and thanks everyone, both participating and in the setup of this event, and of course the audience today. Hope we have a really good discussion. Back to your question first, and if I think games can change the world, I think that's a set of ongoing questions. How in what way, with whom, how do these things come to be, how they're institutionally embedded, financed, all these kind of questions. And I suppose I haven't seen any example of a game that I could say could truly hold such transformative potential in one way or another. And I hope we will go through some of the layers how we can see games as transformative devices, protocols, and the design of these games themselves as transformative processes. But yeah, my path into this has been, well, I suppose since my bachelor's years times doing sociology, I've been interested in yeah, theories of social change and institutional change, notions of utopias and futures and future making. And then I went on to do a master's essentially in sustainable development, where I, yeah, got to know more like the discourse, the power relations that are behind, you know, the different claims to sustainability, and, you know, a lot of mainstream discourses we hear around these days, like smart cities and circular economies, like how to learn to think about those critically, but also to change or create frameworks or learn about frameworks to think about change itself in these kind of contexts. So I was very much interested in, you know, what you might call alternatives to development. So essentially, you know, counter to mainstream narratives of development, such as, you know, post-growth, degrowth narratives, models, policy proposals, to commons transition, to, you know, post-colonial and other post-humanist in the kind of, you know, going beyond nature-human divides, thinking through, you know, representation of non-human actors politically, and these kinds of questions. And so, well, I kind of happened to meet my thesis mentor, Joost Vervoort, from the Netherlands, who essentially does a lot of, yeah, futures and foresight, the scenarios, forecasting, backcasting, these kinds of things, but especially looking at games and gamification, quote unquote, as and especially kind of the politics behind it, and so also going institutionally, but also games in of themselves as, you know, well, I suppose we'll get to that, what games can be, but yeah, so that kind of organically came together, I suppose, in a certain set of queries of how to combine all these different fields into game artifacts or game design processes that account for the politics of sustainability transitions or transformations, and kind of by design empower marginalized people's concepts and things like this, and in this way hold transformative power. And, you know, there's many ways one can implement this, and there's probably other ways of going about it, but I hope that today I'll create, you know, an overview, at least from my perspective, from my vantage point, some yeah, noteworthy, especially recent developments in these fields.
Thank you for this short introduction. I think that during this talk and discussion and presentation, we could go in many different ways and pinpoint many different aspects of the importance of games, board games, designing board games. As you mentioned also in the introduction, I think we will follow up on some of the topics that you mentioned already. Maybe briefly introduce the concept of degrowth, but especially going into the design process of serious board games. Maybe even compare it with the non-serious, if we can call them, the casual or hobby board games, etc. I think it will be it's going to be important that people that are here also shape the way how this discussion today is going to go on. But nevertheless, I think it's the good time to introduce the whole topic and make the basis for the discussion that will follow up. I hope that's okay with everybody. So, Rok, back to you.
Thanks, Igor. Yeah, so I prepared kind of a few slides for this. I'll just go ahead and share the screen. I suppose you should be able to see it. So just as a kind of what I already mentioned, this is a kind of, net of different either, academic or in practice kind of ventures that I sort of try to combine in my practice. And I suppose through the different examples of games, both, out there and examples that I've worked on, I hope we'll create a kind of more detailed picture of how these areas might interrelate. But yeah, like a classical first question regards to the kind of serious games. And I suppose here it's important to kind of see where the notion comes from. It's kind of history, and then the kind of communities and discourses that this is embedded in. Because one could say that a lot of mainstream kind of serious games or gamification approaches could be marked by kind of a specific, maybe one could say even problematic assumptions about the science policy society interface, or like targeting explicitly behavior change and not focusing, say, on social political factors in kind of change processes and things like this. But that's, I suppose, a specific field in of itself. More broadly, serious games are kind of defined as experimental and experiential kind of structured processes that have other outcomes anticipated besides fun or fun for its own sake. I suppose that's a pretty valid and broad definition, but I suppose a more kind of nuanced typology would come would be useful here. So there's a few approaches one could take. The mentioned kind of purely didactic approach towards more critical. For example, some might not know the original story of Monopoly as having been developed to essentially subvert what it now lifts up in the societal spectacle. To subversive, persuasive, but also, and I'm very interested in this, generative. So how games can use prompts, other mechanics, devices to form narratives of either desired futures or critical dystopian futures or things of that nature. It also comes to the world making aspect of games, like not just the act of creating worlds within a game, but also playing, designing, etc. a game as a practice of world making, as an application of the potentials of your agency to design these games as perhaps boundary objects in some context of applications, if your goal is to kind of what in mainstream discourse is referred to multi-stakeholder dialogue and things like this. But again, I'm very much interested in the politics and power dynamics of this, and how game design can kind of step in as essentially a kind of informed activist practice, but that's kind of attuned to the real politics as it exists in terms of parliamentary politics, institutionalized power relations and things like this. So how a game can kind of both bring these people together, but also kind of yeah, empower those, as I said, marginalized voices and ideas at the same time, which is quite difficult in, you know, times where the yeah, economic growth narrative, as you mentioned, like as a small intro to degrowth, is a kind of yeah, if one imagines, you know, to make a game about degrowth as a critique of economic growth and essentially accumulation of capital and well, yeah, disproportionate effects among groups, and how, you know, a return to voluntary simplicity, but also, you know, wholly new models of economy, and not per se like the mainstream narratives of sharing economy, and as we know, Uber or Airbnb, but more cooperative and open, or open source, if you like, forms of these economies. Um, and well, just as a very short intro, but yes, I'm very interested in this context, how games can play a role, whereas, you know, games can play many roles. We'll get to some, you know, I suppose, very different examples in what is their scope, their aim, their targeted audience, their change theory, if you like. So this is a popular quote by a fairly well known, at least in some academic circles, futurist, I suppose you could say, where he claims that games are the closest we can come to do politics repeatedly and to pre-experience alternative futures, in order to, yeah, also expand our, you know, notions both individually and collectively of what kind of pathways, strategies we might take. Just another example might be of interest to people in the video game community of this book on the left, and well, this article that kind of uses it as starting point, looks at both kind of development of the video game industry and its relation to capitalism, but also kind of conceptualizes, you know, games that might hold, you know, some transformative potential. So this is a bit cut and dry, like kind of overview of some recent and some not so recent works being done on these subjects. Well, I'll be happy to send you this PowerPoint and everyone as a resource. This is just a kind of way to overview that, yeah, a lot is being said about these topics, especially in the last few years, although it's not at all a very new topic. And one could say serious games or simulation games or things of that nature have been with us for quite a long time, for more than half a century, most prominently in the form of war games. But yeah, that's another story. But you can, for example, in The Gaming of Policy and the Politics of Gaming, the author goes very much into depth into that. But yeah, as we can see, like yeah, the books don't necessarily all have to, yeah, have games or playing in the title, and this is just a small kind of overview of what is out there. But yeah, as you can see, there's a lot of entry points concerning these. One, for example, here is very interesting in how games can kind of yeah, get us to experience or embody different temporalities that are kind of connected to, you know, the notion of Anthropocene, of us being in a kind of period where humans, or, you know, the systems that are upheld kind of have this fundamental influence on, you know, the global climate and so on, and how, you know, through games or other design experiences or interactive scenarios, one can kind of embody these elongated timelines or other things. And yeah, connected to the whole field of, you know, serious games, futures games, is, you know, the whole area of speculative design, under which you could also place these sort of critical games, or gamified platforms, if you like, and things of that nature. And well, here's again only a few, but quite interesting takes, I think, on what board games can do. And I've included also just a few other video game uh, examples. And yeah, these are mostly, not all, but mostly grassroots endeavors by one form of cooperative or another, probably not so unlike Udruga Smart, um, in that, you know, fighting for you know, just causes, if we frame it in this more general sense, and creating, you know, a community tool essentially, to ideate, create narratives around, or embody experience, you know, what does transition mean, or what it could look like, or other things. And yeah, in terms of the video game scene, and like more like serious video games, I suppose you could say, well, there's a whole heap of you know, both research, discussion, um, and this is just one example of an overview of what kind of, you know, imaginaries or imaginings are kind of built into some of these games. Examples, here we have oligarchy on top, the arcade wire oil god, and urban climate architect. Um, and the article reviews a few others, but concludes, like I have concluded in my own kind of searches, that very few games kind of address the politics, or you know, the the social, cultural power, etc. factors in, you know, sustainability transitions. And, you know, one example, I suppose, of almost, you could say, kind of depoliticizing uh, effects games can have is the goals, you know, the SDGs, kind of a pretty cut and dry way for, you know, kids to learn about the SDGs, while, you know, it's, you know, well, it's everywhere, and you know, we can say that it's very mainstream, hegemonic discourse. There's, you know, a whole lot of critiques that are to be said about this framework, not in the least this goal 8 of economic growth here being kind of at the heart of this whole formula. Um, But on the other hand, here we have, at the European Commission level, this game was commissioned by the European Research Center, and it's a kind of scenario exploration game, essentially. Um, these are kind of examples, what you could say, and what I'm interested in, yeah, refer to futures games, or, you know, foresight games. And this is, you know, a lot of, you know, futures and foresight jargon, like, you know, trends, drivers of change, scenarios. And yeah, essentially players assemble these. These are, yeah, most of the examples that I will list here are also freely available to download online and free to use and experiment with. So on top left, we have a pretty famous example, The Thing from the Future by Stuart Candy. He's kind of known to kind of be one of the coiners of the term experiential futures and experiential foresight, kind of going with this line that up until now, like futures and foresight practice has relied a lot on, you know, statistical data or visualizations of different scenarios, and these kind of, you know, grids and such, which is not, it doesn't really reflect, you know, what's actually being said with these. We need to go into the experiential realm, and we need to kind of include the public in both the design and the experience of these futures in more creative forms. And one such form is games, which can be board games, video games, can be live action role-playing games, combinations thereof, also online platforms to co-create futures, narratives, things like this. One of the examples of the latter is on the bottom right with the Foresight engine by the Institute for the Future, where they had applied this model to a lot of things, basically using a Twitter-like interface online. And then we have the Utopoly kind of creation process, which is one of the games that are out there that concern more utopian imaginaries. And I suppose this is quite a common start for a lot of people who are kind of just getting into serious games, or maybe have a lot of background knowledge in something, but not maybe games specifically, to kind of just stick to what you know. And most of us know Monopoly, and well, it creates both a framework, but also certain barriers that you can get creative around. It's fun to first experiment maybe with different currencies and such, although it's good that that's not a venture in of itself, but has a broader designerly purpose and such. But these are kind of both. These can be very fun both as a kind of co-design venture with different groups of people kind of designing a game and then using Monopoly as a scaffold. And there's various examples of this. Utopoly, of course, through Utopia. I'm just putting in here a few Utopia inspirations that are out there. Don't necessarily have a lot to do with games as such, but I think are nonetheless kind of key in opening up the imaginary and maybe those kind of provoking new design concepts for games. Now, this is another similar example of Commonsopoly, as we see the adding opoly at the end of something seems to be quite popular. So yeah, if you make a game, I would ask, please don't just do something and add opoly at the end. So first, you might get sued, and second, it's not very original at this point. But yeah, the game is quite interesting. I haven't had a chance to play it. I must say, but as far as I read into it, it kind of explains, commons-based economy kind of concepts and models, essentially in the broadest sense, kind of cooperatives and new forms of public, civic, or commons partnership. Degrowthtopia is seems like a newer, just kind of experimental prototype that popped up on the internet a few months back. But I just thought to show that this kind of field is slowly emerging, and artifacts are coming out which kind of delve into these topics. There's also various collectives around the world that specifically specialize in game design. There's alliances of different indie game production companies based on cooperative models. And one of the most prominent of these is, I suppose, the Tessa Collective. Here are just some examples of games. And basically this is a good example of how most games that are kind of this nature come from crowdfunding, from Kickstarter or similar kind of platforms. And it's a kind of logical move also these days. I believe the board game section of Kickstarter is essentially the biggest in terms of money inflow. And it's quite popular, although you see, 5 million euros going to games with shiny, polished, orcs and things like this in fantasy or space orcs or what have you. Whereas, these games usually, these are not production companies. They don't have a lot of startup capital and things like this. Just saying, out of also being a practitioner, freelancer and things like this. And there's, one could point out that most games that, have these kind of aspiration probably won't come from institutions or, like mainstream production companies or things like that. So in terms of, creating, scaling, funding these type of things, I think, yeah, there will have to be some, creative thinking in that involved. But there's also, digital, like video game production companies, and one kind of prominent one in the last years is Colestia. They made, a collage of few, mostly are fairly small, but kind of to the point uh, games. One example that I've played with in the past is post-capitalism here, which is, quite direct in its name. But essentially what you do is you click away at the different elements of the city, and once you click one to kind of transform into a more uh, cooperative form or things of that nature, then another part of the city, becomes worse, and you essentially have to unlock in a particular way a city towards a kind of transition. And well, I mentioned before that, online platforms are also an interesting take. They might not, include gamified elements, although some do. But this is a kind of example I've had a chance not to work with directly, but I am talking with the creators on how to kind of create a next step with it, which would involve probably some elements of game. But essentially, it's a kind of open library of future scenarios. So essentially, it's kind of a proof of concept or prototype, but the idea is that people, organizations could upload the different scenarios of the future that they generate in different projects, and the community could create, tags to make them searchable, create, dialogue between different groups on, scenarios and similar topics and such, or to, use them further for, games or things like that. And another kind of online platform kind of thing is, maps of alternative economies, let's say. Some examples are like the transfer map, or seeds of good anthropocenes is another, or atlas of utopias. And I'm very much interested also in how games can kind of take these, let's say, commons of knowledge, or like, different overviews of what's out there in terms of, prefigurative practices or transformative social innovations, or however you choose to call them, but to, play with them in games in different senses, both as a kind of, as a game would enable people to learn about these things or do something with them, or to, experience them and have some sort of interactions, just as an example. So this is another project that I've had a chance to work with. It's ongoing at the moment, but it's led by Peter Bloom of Essex University in collaboration with a local like augmented virtual reality company. And essentially the idea is to have an augmented reality map of the city, where different buildings are and kind of marked. These would be buildings of special social significance, shared social significance, because a particularity of this city is that the inhabitants are separated by a literal wall. This is in Belfast. And the idea is that the game, pointing to these, pointing players to these buildings of shared interest, they can post comments and different content on what these places could be like or be used for community purposes. And in this way, kind of users collectively slowly map out ideas in the space itself of the city, of course, this augmented virtual reality space, but overlain on top of the buildings themselves as a kind of future building endeavor. And this is kind of a small offshoot that we did with Peter as part of this project. But yeah, it could be interesting for some. Twine is a platform where you can essentially create branching storyline type of games. So, you know, the click-based game where you can make choices and follow different storyline branches. But you can also, do simple Java things or things like that. But we tried to bring to life these kinds of alternative spaces of the city also within a game narrative. And this is just a small experiment, but at some point it will also be available online if people would like to play with. But if you're new to games or game design, Twine could be an interesting resource for you, I think, if you want to experiment with narrative-based games. So another project I was involved in is through our global swarm group, or that's what we call ourselves. And we cooperated with Nesta, UK-based NGO, on our Futures project, which essentially concerned mapping different participatory futures examples of games, platforms, processes, applications that deal with public participation in shaping futures. The report is available online as well. And an offshoot we did from the project is we designed a small game that's essentially meant for futures practitioners. So essentially a kind of, a combinatorial kind of generation where, you have prompts to kind of create new methods, create new foresight methods to involve people in wicked problems of today, such as climate change. And another one I've personally kind of experimented with, I call it A Day in the Life, Public Luxury in 2035. It's quite simple. The structure might resemble, what we might have played back in the day in school, where you have a person, a place, and an activity, and you come up with all sorts of different things when you pass on to the other person to complete the story. But this one was oriented around, essentially, how can we imagine high quality public services broadly understood in the future? And we used this game to facilitate a kind of exchange online with George Monbiot, like between our local climate justice movement, Mladi za podnebnu pravičnost, and George Monbiot. And this is, I think, the last example of my projects. I call it Game Changers, the game. It's kind of a work in progress, and it will probably also have a Kickstarter campaign or something behind it next year. You can keep an eye out for that. But essentially it kind of takes the form of Monopoly, but kind of you're not fighting for different properties. There's two teams, capitalism and a kind of something opposite to capitalism that the players define themselves. There's a battle between them to essentially capture, co-opt, or transform different initiatives. and narratives of new economy. And you use different prompt cards to create storylines which are assessed by other players, which affects kind of the progression of the game. And back in my master's years, I also had this wonderful chance to, just as a kind of overview of some other examples of games or game type events that are going on. This is very interesting. I think one of a kind. Also, these are, I think since 2015 or 16, there's been a regular yearly game jam that kind of brings together people from the Copernicus Institutes of Sustainable Development, and I believe other people at Utrecht University with the HACO, so the Arts and Design faculty in Utrecht, and they design with students video games, board games, and other kinds of sustainability games, I guess we can call them in this context. And just, I think, shout outs to one or two initiatives. Like I just saw this, a couple of months back. Sadly, it's over now, but I believe the whole event is available online. But it's, gaming for the commons. So exactly, and some of the commonsopoly people, for example, which I mentioned previously, are speaking, and others. About games for social change in alternative economies context. And this games for impact, which you can actually still catch. I believe it starts tomorrow, and I believe it's an initiative based in Poland. I think they have a conference every year, but I suspect some interesting things should be there. So that's it for my kind of introductory presentation. I suppose, I'd give it back to you, Igor.
Well, thank you. I think we will give it back to you because we got first comments. But before that, I think that, at least from my standpoint, I think this was a really great overview of what serious board games are, why are they called serious, and with which serious fields are they connected, how they can be used. I think you gave a lot of great examples for all of us that want to follow up and learn more about specific games, whether they are board games or video games or platforms, and a lot of sources of information and knowledge for those who want to learn and know more. So I really thank you for that. I think in less than half an hour you gave really a lot of food for thought, but also places to go and learn more about it. I have a series of comments and questions, but I'm not important here. So I would like to tell you about the first comments and questions we got in chat. So Ms. Tanya Winter asked whether a pandemic...
sorry, Igor, could I just disturb you for a minute? Like nature call? Nature call? Could I just come back
let's
in
have,
half a minute?
Sure, Rok, I understand. I hope everybody is okay with a short 5-minute break. You can think about your questions and comments, and we'll wait for Rok and continue after 5 minutes. Rok, is that enough?
Sure, that's more than enough.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Dok čekamo Roka, ja vam se najljepše zahvaljujem na pitanjima. Možda čisto za prvu ruku, za neki povratnu informaciju. Kako vam je bilo predavanje? Je li vam bilo zanimljivo? Jeste čuli informacije koje ste očekivali? Je li ovo možda izvan sfere onoga što ste očekivali na ovoj radionici? Možda možete upaliti netko mikrofon ili napisati u chatu. A ono što sam rekao, vratit ćemo se na Tanjine, Janine komentare i predstaviti ih Roku da ih i on iskomentira. Mogu se naravno i drugi uključiti vezano za nekoliko društvenih igara koje ste spomenuli u chatu.
Igore, mogu se uključiti samo kratko?
Dapače, Tamara.
Tanja nam je zapravo David, ako sam dobro skužila u chatu, Bog
Aha,
Davide.
sorry, Bog David, odlično.
I Lucija se javila, mislim da je Rok rekao da će nam poslati prezentaciju i da ćemo ju moći proslijediti svim sudionicima, upravo zato što je naveo puno literature i puno primjera koje možete naravno koristiti dalje.
Super, hvala ti puno Tamara na ovome. Davide, oprosti. Tanja nam je, ja mislim, bila na nekim našim radionicama, onda nisam dalje uopće povezivao ime, sliku i video.
Nema veze.
Super. Sjajno. Hvala ti, znači doći ćemo na pitanje o pandemiku, i mislim da si spomenuo još i sajt, jel tako? Tako da pitat ćemo Roka o tome. I ponavljam još jednom, evo iskoristite priliku da možda formulirate još neko pitanje ili komentara, onda ćemo se vratiti na razgovor sa Rokom. Evo ja moram priznati da je meni stvarno bilo zanimljivo i zapravo su sva moja očekivanja ispunjena za ovaj pregled teme za koju smo odabrali za danas. I možda dok ga čekamo, znači ako netko ima još neku igru o kojoj želi da raspravimo ili dati neki primjer, ja bih možda mogao spomenuti još igru Block on Block, znači aktivnostima black bloka u urbanim insurekcijama, ako možemo to tako reći, ali ovo što sam sad spomenuo je zapravo samo bila jedna blaga tranzicija prema tome da nam se Rok ponovno uključi. Could you please turn on your microphone, Rok, so we can discuss several games that were mentioned in chat. So David asked whether Matt Leacock's Pandemic mega popular board game can fall into one of the categories that you were talking about. How would you relate to that game? But also we have, so Anna and David mentioned Flashpoint Rescue, Dice Hospital, Site, and one game that I would put a bit aside because I know there were some studies regarding it, and that is Vitala Serdar's CO2 second chance, I think, right? So can you comment on the games I mentioned, but actually our participants mentioned in chat?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I must say that there's quite a lot of games out there. Most, if not all of those titles were new to me. So yeah, it would be hard, I suppose, for me to comment on those. There was one with regards to the pandemic called the New Normal game, which might interest participants. The New Normal game. It says a new experiment has been launched that allows for a measure of spiritual relief during COVID-19 pandemic by giving players the agency to imagine a better world.
Cool, because I think that maybe I can just give a brief follow-up. I would like to involve more experienced gamers and board game designers to get on as well. So Pandemic, I think it's interesting because it's a cooperative play. It has also a legacy version. It has a theme that is quite relevant today, of course. And maybe that could be an introduction to another topic that board games cover different themes. And there is always, or quite often, discussion whether themes comes first when designing a game, or experience, or mechanisms. So maybe we could follow up in sense that you could maybe present your design process and how you go about it, so we can compare notes in a way. And we'll follow up also on your messages, not yours, Rok, but everybody else's in chat, so we can also comment on them. So, Rok, your design process, briefly.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think one of the most, the basic, like the first step, I suppose, is building up intent. So like kind of not just what the game is about, but what you're trying to do with it, right? So essentially what you're doing is reflecting or crafting the theory of change of the game. So, one could say that different games embody different theories of how, change happens, if they're about, social change or institutional change or change of economies and so on. But yeah, it's also good to turn them back down on the process itself, and think through, how do theories of change inform my own game design process, and not just at the individual level, although there's many examples where they're made by individual people, but a lot of the times it's collectives, and a lot of the times it's also the kind of open format of the game, or the kind of rawness or unfinishedness of the game, that invites different people into participating, not just as a passive or active player or however, but also invites them in as a game designer. And this is what I've used a lot, I suppose, next to my own ideation, to then engage with people who either on the content side or the game design side or other aspects kind of have a something to say about or contribute to. That's kind of been where I went, and yeah, made it a point to kind of experiment with it in meaningful places, and with people who might be the end users of this, and all throughout the process, logging different questions, layers, where these questions appear, which inform this iterative design process. There's of course also kind of licensing things, like in the new economy space, and a lot of these games here as examples are licensed under Creative Commons, which is, I think, a move a lot of people take in terms of embodying that ethos of the game also within its openness and the license. But it's not always easy to if you want to make a living out of creating transformative games, it's tough in terms of you've got to be creative in terms of how you go about that. If you're going for impact, because I suppose there's a lot, or scale or things like that. It can be very local, specific, and empowering. That way. I'm very much interested in creating translocal connections through games, and like using capacities of internet and such, but that's not exclusively. But yeah, in terms of co-design, specifically in my case, I went to fellow activists, to different researchers involved in these fields in the Netherlands, where the picture was. To game design students, and just kind of get these different takes and learning kind of on the way about also new ways to look at games. And I guess it's worth to point out that it's quite a internally transformative process. Like when you design a game, you're basically kind of trying to articulate a certain system. In the mechanics, you're essentially trying to emulate with realism or not, and maybe one or the other is the point, but these broader social processes that you're trying to capture, and in that way it's an artifact of your own thinking. It can be on a kind of embodiment of a theory of change, and that design itself then turns back on you and changes you in a way, like when you externalize something like that, create an artifact that really sets out a very clear logic of how things seem to be and how things might change, and questions of that nature, I think really opens up the space for the designer. So in that way, it's an iterative process between designer and the designed object, or the whole community of practice that's established around it, and of course the community of users.
Thank you, Rok. We have one very David, thank you for your comments. I hope we will be able to see your game at some point. But we have one very concrete question, and I would like to ask you, Rok, to explain why do you think that Go goals, the UN goal, is a bad example of a serious game or of a game, because I have a thing or two to say about it as well. Rok, please.
Yeah, well, it's quite a cheap shot in some ways. You could say that. And I don't necessarily mean to be totally critical of it. And there's also, a very clear place for games whose role is essentially didactic. But at the same time, like as I said, the Sustainable Development Goals, as much as it's kind of internalized in a lot of circles, and there's very clear problems with the sustainable development line, or as a discourse, or how the policies and institutions work around it. So I mean, in that sense, it's problematic because clearly at the design level, there is not much reflection going on, in terms of critical thinking or inspiring critical thinking. Again, a game doesn't have to do that, but for me, I think that that's an important element in any kind of serious game of the type that we're talking about here. And yeah, I believe, in the specific case of the SDG game, there's a lot of, translations around the world of this game and, being used. And, this, it's very tough to say, it's a, you might not even want to measure it, but we would like to have some sort of notion of how games are actually transformative. And, there's several, research lines that try to capture that. In terms of how they're transformative. In this case, there's direct and indirect effects that you could say. I mean, it's maybe introducing something that's problematic, but maybe it's opening a new line of inquiry for that particular student that then goes on to research and develop criticality on their own or with the help of other mentors. But a lot of the times this is just not present. The school system also doesn't allow for much of it, or is dependent on particular teachers to spend the time to do that, usually over time. There's various institutional inertias at play that make the experience in the end quite a depoliticized kind of endeavor. Yeah.
If I can maybe just shortly follow up on that, because when we started this project, we were aware of that game. For those who don't know, and maybe do know about the game Snakes and Ladders, it's a quite popular, simple kids game where you have a board with some fields, you roll a die, and you go on the field where the dice point you, right? And the next step, the next second mechanism is that you pick up a card, you have a question, most often multiple choice question, and you try to answer the question. Basically, it's kind of gamified way to pretty basic and cheap to go through some basic facts regarding the 17 sustainable development goals, right? So when we started designing our game, we said, okay, we'll try to make a game that at least resembles a modern tabletop game, which doesn't introduce games in a lame way, let's say so. So this is a simple mechanic, and it's not fun, and it can be counterproductive, I think. When you give to young people, students, etc., a game like that, and you present it as a game, it can be actually counterproductive, because next time when they have in hand a good game, educational, just for fun, or serious game, they will say, no, I'm not interested trying to fool me around, answering the question about which is the poorest African country in order to proceed on the board, you know. So that's my standpoint on why that game is bad. In the broader sense, I think it's very important to introduce games, both video games and board games, into the educational system, regarding the didactical power they have. But not only playing games that do have an educational component, no matter whether it's about the theme, like some of the games that we mentioned, or mechanisms games use, or experience, or something else, right? We could maybe just go stay a bit longer in the field of education and talk about it, and ask all of you to share maybe your experiences, good or bad examples, no matter what, and maybe to share just one thing about our project. Beside designing the game and play testing it with high school students, we also try to have a short amount of time to put students into the shoes of board game designers, because I think there is a lot of value in horizontal way in fostering and gaining horizontal learning outcomes in terms of critical thinking, problem analysis, problem solving, that doesn't have to have anything with the theme. It doesn't have to be sustainable development. It doesn't have to be climate change. It doesn't have to be geography or history or Croatian language or Slovenian, whatever. You know, so I think there is multifaceted environment that could be used within our formal, non-formal, and informal ways how young people, and not only them, also grown-ups, adults, can learn by playing games, thinking about games, and especially designing games and going through all the processes that a game designer goes when he or she thinks about their game idea. Thank you, Eva. Can we go a little bit more on that? Because we do have, I know that Professor Ivan Kosak, I don't know if he's with us, is quite active in that field. There are some other designers in Croatia and organizations that in Rijeka, Eva, for instance, in Dom Mladih and some others that are in recent, maybe even months or years, so more and more different good examples, tests, experiments pop up, because it's obvious, it's hyped. Okay, that's cool, that's great. But also it provides even funding to experiment with games in different ways, with different audiences, beneficiaries, or users, whatever we would like to call them. Rok and everybody else, if you would like to follow up on that, please do. Rok.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, it's a very good meditation on the subject. I have similar experience and thoughts on that. Yeah, I can mention that throughout the Game Changers, the game board game that's in development process. Yeah, in the specific case when I went to some, well, they were game design students, so they were, you know, more apt into this. But yeah, we structured it in such a way so that, you know, try out the game first a little bit, have a break, have a round of reflections, pre-prepared design questions or people from questions from the audience, and suggesting improvements, different iterations of the game. Like one thing is to kind of skip over to, you know, some future states of the game that you can just, you know, go in and then play out and test different mechanics, or you know, create a wholly different, so hack or otherwise change the game to fit your purposes. So yeah, I think that's quite an overlooked kind of part of it. And, you know, games come from somewhere, and, you know, there's a whole process behind it. A lot of it, you know, is you know, major companies, institutions, but these kinds of endeavors really usually come from grassroots, from NGO, from activists and such. And I think, yeah, it's a whole part of the co-creation ethos, and both, yeah, it's a collaborative way of creating a shared artifact that kind of represent a certain logic of the world, or a certain way of seeing of the world. And I think, the process of getting to that, and all the new questions that are posed and discussed, and issues resolved, and all of these things have a major impact on everyone involved, that go well beyond the game itself. A lot of the times it's the process is the most important, and not necessarily what you come up with at the end, at least in this kind of educational formal or informal. And I think, yeah, it's key to have also some really good examples to be working with, or hack, and that's a lot of times kind of a shortcut to thinking about yeah, what kind of games you would like to design.
Right. Thank you. I'm looking while listening to you also in the chat. We have some other questions. One of the question is, so Sandro mentioned several games. Again, COVID-19 scenario in pandemic. Also, I think, Sandro, that you answered to Eva's question about maybe the gateway or casual games to introduce potential gamers into the hobby. But I think that Eva asked about three serious games to start with. I know that you went through several of them, but maybe to pinpoint three serious board games to follow up and learn the rules, or maybe even do it yourself if they are available. Sorry, as print and plays.
Yeah. In that context, definitely, like, Commonsopoly is quite become a staple, if not, for other reasons, because it's one of the rare examples of a game that focuses on that specific topics. So
Right.
Commonsopoly being one, and it's also close to Monopoly in design, and probably close to a lot of people. So it's probably a good entry point in thinking about this. So, yeah, there's a French game. There's a couple of like online resources available, and playtests. Le Grand Jeu. It's also in one of the slides. LEGRANDEJEU. And, well, yeah, this is so the scenario exploration system. So the one we saw with the concentric circles, and kind of creating scenario with the drivers of change and things like that. It's quite a very kind of mashing foresight and games in a very direct way. But I think maybe precisely because of that, it can be a good first step in thinking about games in an imagining futures kind of context.
Right. Thank you, Rok. So we heard, yeah, Tamara, please.
Just to one reference about what Rok just mentioned. Ottilia, one of the participants, put in chat the link for Commonsopoly. So I will rewrite it again for those who are interested into downloading it.
Okay, thank you, Ottilia, and thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Rok, as well. I would just like to mention, so Eva is quite active in the chat, so that also reminds me that Eva was mentoring a group of young people with some of her colleagues into producing and designing another board game. So maybe, Eva, you can share in the Facebook event where did you get with Rinovatori and your board game, right? Thank you, Eva. Or you can put it in the chat here as well, so people who would like to know more about it, they can follow up. Okay, we have 13 minutes left. So if you have any question, any comment, any thoughts to share, now is the time, because I have one last question before maybe fading out from today's lecture. Rok, you mentioned several times the word gamification. Again, it's one of the hyped words in the last decade. It's used all over the place for all different purposes, good and bad. Maybe for those who are not familiar with the term gamification, you can give us a brief introduction, because it's relevant for the topic, but also to distinguish it and recognize the dark side of gamification in just 2 or 3 minutes, Rok, if it's possible.
Sure, thanks. I'll give it a shot. I mean, I read a thing or two about it and have certain opinions about it. I guess broadly you could define it as you know, taking something that's not a game and applying some sort of game mechanics, either, you know, role play, or yeah, there's different layers to it. And it can be, you know, a simple narrative devices or things of that nature. But essentially, yeah, one of the main critiques, I suppose you could say, and you know, it being very much a kind of buzzword, like that it's quite often leads to yeah, again, very kind of technical representations of the content that it's trying to discuss. So like, or you know, it's applied, for example, you know, the social crediting systems or things like that. So you know, there's lots of layers to it. It can be, you know, gamification in terms of, you know, how to create a platform that has simple game elements to co-create new knowledge and ideas, or it can, you know, be an augment of the welfare system, like experiments in China or something, and you know, experiments with alternative currencies and tokens and ways of kind of recognizing, you know, contributions and all these things. Yeah, it can quickly lead into some kind of dystopian or Orwellian future. Um, and also there's another problematic side of gamification in terms of, you know, this gamify everything, or you know, that it's becoming a game, then, you know, it's or has some element, and then it's fun and kind of ameliorates what the whole platform is actually trying to do. So yeah, there's a couple of sides to it. It's sometimes also a lazy man's way out, or a kind of way for NGOs to apply, you know, fancy sounding projects or something like this. It's also quite rampant, I suppose. Not necessarily, you know, ill meaning or anything, but it is out there. So yeah, I mean, I'm interested in gamification in this, maybe gamifying, you know, foresight processes, like how to make creating scenarios of the future more interactive, but not, you know, interactive per se. There's got to be some design intent and designerly vision behind it, I think, that is usually not present and a lot of these mainstream, yeah, gamification endeavors. Like using games or gamification to think about, yeah, theories of change or futures. Those are the kinds of gamifications that I'm interested in, or how political processes or institutions or forces are represented in games, or nature or climate change, etc.
Thank you, Rok. I think during this conversation, we are kind of trying to combine two tracks. Our interest in casual or hobby board games, also using board games, game mechanics in, let's call them serious fields, in foreseeing the future, creating new models for sustainable living, let's call it, not sustainable development, for fostering and strengthening the promotion, the participation, especially of marginalized people, etc. But maybe we could go back again to board games. So there is another question, if you can answer, that's okay. Could you recommend a commercial game or games that you're aware of and that you recognize that it has a transformative power in line and in terms that we were discussing today?
Thanks. Yeah, just before that, I wanted to get back to there's one other aspect that I probably didn't
Sure.
discuss that much, which is the citizen science angle of games and gamification. So like there's examples of biodiversity games where essentially there's a platform, people participate. You can imagine a kind of Pokemon Go for actual species, or invasive species, or endangered species and things like that. So there's dozens upon dozens of things like that, or gamified ways for citizens to monitor air quality and things like that. But yeah, a lot of times you can question the fun element in all of this, but yeah, it's up to the designers to kind of work that through. But in terms of yeah, existing commercial games, I must say I'm not a big gamer per se, partly also because yeah, I haven't bought a new computer in some time to handle the newer games. But just one shout out could be the new Civilization 6 game, which just came out, and it's known for its previous versions to have some sort of climate change mechanics, but most of them have been benign, and not much has changed in this case. But here, and it's kind of a civilization building tool, right? And kind of like Age of Empires, if you're familiar, and stuff like this. But there's a upgraded climate change mechanic, and essentially every civilization you develop there creates a sea level rise of at least 1.5 meters. And basically every activity in the game, every plant, every activity you do has a CO2 monitor attached to it. So you kind of see CO2 dynamics when you're building, evolving your civilization.
Rok, thank you. Maybe to follow up and maybe suggest that we might meet all of us again and continue our discussion about both serious games, serious video games, board games, etc. I would just like to point out to everybody that yesterday or the day before yesterday, we posted a list of board games which are not transformative. They don't have the transformative power, and they are not actually serious board games in terms that we are discussing them today. They were bought for our local community library, and they do have some thematic connections with the green themes, let's call it like that. So maybe a shout out to some of the games that you might like to look at by looking to the article on Rasadnik FYI. We will share the link to that text in the chat. The thing is that I think that it's good to merge and to blur the distinction between a thematic board game, casual hobby board game, an educational one, and a serious one. Because I think for understanding different concepts, using games as different tools or approaches, we can mesh them all together and put in a big bowl, or separate them for what they actually are. So just for those who want to know more about, we decided to go for, I know that board gamers will recognize the titles like Photosynthesis, Reef, Planet, and similar games that I don't know if we can call them educational. In some way, I think we can. Are they transformative games? I think they are in a way, but they are not intended as such. While when we are talking about serious board games, the purpose of serious board games is a bit different than the purpose of modern hobby tabletop games. And as I said earlier, I think it's great to separate them. It's great to talk about them in the same context, but not every game should fit all the boxes. So we can just have fun playing Yahtzee, or we can try to make something else with Yahtzee mechanics or Monopoly mechanics, and try to see games, no matter whether we are playing them, designing them, thinking about them, in more than just a fun activity or a great hobby. So that would be my final words for today. I hope that's okay with you. But I think Rok should close this event. We have 1 minute before we go to the final poll, so please stay and answer 2 very simple yes/no questions. So we have a feedback from you through Zoom poll. Rok, let's conclude this part of the lecture and discussion with a conclusion. Rok, please.
Sure, thanks, Igor. Well, might as well come back to the question of can
Right.
games change the world? And yeah, as I said at the outset, it's still a kind of open question that I'm trying to resolve, and I suppose it will be open until we see or design ourselves some games with, you know, I mean, as we said, there can be different scales of application, or, you know, nested scales. It might be meant for local, but can be modified, you know, translocally, as a, you know, establishing a global community around it, to very local specific, to also, you know, the vocabularies and the particular struggles that are happening there. But yeah, we are living in kind of unprecedented times, and like change, like radical change, should come sooner rather than later, seems to be, you know, a very strong consensus, and yet the barriers kind of seem still almost insurmountable. So how do you design within, through, or beyond that to create change? Yeah, is the question that I'm trying to embody and pursue in these artifacts. I think one of the most important things is to, well, yeah, criticality, reflexivity, of course, but also just getting your hands dirty and making something. And once you have something, like showing it to your friends, and, you know, getting the ball rolling, because the process is really transformative in of itself, and I think, you know, one embraces all that goes with the process, the highs and the lows. But yeah, at the same time, if we really want to effectuate real change at the scales required, I think it's worthy to think about games as a medium, or, you know, a very broad set of very different mediums that can also be, of course, creatively combined in kind of transmedial projects. But like to imagine, yeah, interventions, or game as interventions, or game co-design interventions, or both, at the scale that it can effectuate real change. And to me, a question in that is to think about what are the spheres, or the concepts, or what have you, that these games should focus on content-wise, that, you know, people get to play with, experience, generate themselves, share, and do something with them in the real world.
Rok, thank you very much for everything. I hope we will be able to continue our discussion and rethinking the world via board games, video games, and serious board games. I hope your Kickstarter campaign will be successful. But before that, I hope you will finish your game because we are currently in post-production phase with thousands of unexpected situations, and that's just great. Unfortunately, some of the questions from the chat will not be answered today, but David, Dejan, Anna, and others, we think that we can invite you all, of course, to follow up on today's discussion when Tamara and I are going to present our design process, pitfalls, decisions, the reasons why we made decisions about a game, Rok, listen to that, that promotes sustainable development goals in, I hope, at least we hope, fun and more engaging ways that go goals, right? Again, it's a simple roll and write game, and so this is also the invitation to join us when we will have the discussion about it. I think there are some great comments and questions that will be, in a way, at least today, be unanswered. I hope you have, all of you have had the opportunity to follow up the links, the questions and comments in the chat, and that you are ready for the closure of this meeting, hopefully filling out our little poll. So Tamara, if you could please start it.
Yes, I just wanted to share one thing, Igor.
Right.
Because of many board games and games that were mentioned in the chat, I call all of you to save the chat. I think you have this possibility in your Zoom. So you will be able to have the links that each of us mentioned in the chat and the different board games that were mentioned. And now I will start the poll.
Thank you, Tamara.
I hope you see it.
Yes, yes, it's up.
Okay.
Okay, so we have two simple questions to answer. We'll give you 10 more seconds to fill out the form if you'd like to, and then take the screenshot in order to have it for our archives and report. Okay, Tamara, we can share the results and go through them briefly. Okay, I think this was a successful event. I hope that you are all satisfied. Most of you are very satisfied, and thank you for that. I think we had really good food for thought, inspiration and idea, and something to think about again after this discussion. I hope you will all join us on our next presentations and lectures from our colleagues from Slovenia. Follow us on Facebook and on our website. And thank you all for being with us in the last 96 minutes. Thank you all, and see you on some other occasion. I hope again discussing board games and games in general. Rok, thank you very much for joining us and for your lecture. Goodbye to all.